All of this is really well known and well documented, and everybody's been talking about this for, at least 20, 25 years. Anyhow, be that as it may. But for me, the very first recommendation was the most significant. It said, "It is critical that both the Northern Territory and federal governments commit to genuine consultation with Aboriginal people in designing initiatives for Aboriginal communities to address child sexual abuse and neglect." This recommendation was strongly informed by the willingness and determination of many of the Aboriginal community to work with the authorities to address the problems they faced. Of course, we recognised straight away that these recommendations would take a lot of resources to implement, and we knew that the Northern Territory budget is tiny in comparison to the resources of the Commonwealth. So although we called for the Northern Territory Government to show leadership, we were explicit that this required national action and that the federal government needed to provide much of the resources for the solutions. Hence our call for Aboriginal child sexual abuse in the Northern Territory to be designated as an issue of urgent national significance by both the Australian and Northern Territory governments. We delivered the Little Children of Sacred report to the Northern Territory government in April 2007, by ourselves, I might add, in a back room at Parliament House. There wasn't a single politician there, just Rex and I and a whole room of reporters. Now, maybe Rex and I were naive. We sincerely thought that given the level of public concern and the fact that they had commissioned the inquiry, the Northern Territory government would want to act urgently to address the issues we found. We thought that they would ask themselves, what can we do within our current resources, and how many more resources do we need? And we expected, and we're ready to be part of, an urgent and formal approach to Canberra to get a federal commitment to a joint effort to address the issues raised in our reports. But nothing seemed to happen. The inertia and lack of interest that we had noted during our consultations with some government agencies seemed to have struck again. I asked myself once again, as an outsider to those government processes, why did the government find it so hard to act? The Northern Territory government, that is. I asked myself, so why did the Northern Territory government commission a report which they must have known would identify areas of long-term neglect where money and large amounts of money would need to be spent? Was our inquiry merely a way to deal with the media and political pressure that had built up during 2006? Were we just supposed to be part of the government's effort to manage the issue? These are cynical thoughts perhaps, and to counterbalance them I remind myself that I know that there are also people in the NT government who are pushing for real action on the basis of the report. But before that internal struggle between action and inaction could be resolved, before the inertia could be overcome, the federal government beat them to the punch. On 21 June 2007, the then Prime Minister and his Federal Minister for Indigenous Affairs announced the emergency intervention into the Northern Territory. This announcement was firmly predicated on the Northern Territory government's lack of response to Little Children are Sacred. But in actual fact, there was almost no relationship between what we recommended and what the Northern Territory intervention encompassed. And this is becoming even more blurred as we go along. Our key recommendation about working with Aboriginal communities was ignored. Where we emphasised the need for resources and for flexible processes of engagement with Aboriginal families and communities, the intervention emphasised external control and blanket provisions affecting all Aboriginal people. There were many elements of the intervention announced that day. Not all of these were wide off the mark. There were moves to restrict alcohol availability, enforce school attendance for children, increase policing and ban pornography. However, no one needed an inquiry to tell them about that these measures were needed. There had been broad agreement for a long time about exactly these kinds of actions and numerous recommendations from studies and reports to act on all these issues. Aboriginal kids were not going to school. They haven't been at school now for a generation. There are 2 generations of Aboriginal kids who cannot read and write. There are in fact cohorts of kids in remote communities who have developed a communication, a form of language which only that 30 can understand. They can't communicate with their own, even their own families. They can't communicate with anybody outside that cohort of 30 or 40 kids. And no one seems to think this is an issue. But the majority of the headline elements of the intervention were deeply problematic. They included compulsory health checks of Aboriginal children to check for evidence of abuse, blanket quarantining of welfare payments to all Aboriginal people, leading to the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act, plus the compulsory acquisition of Aboriginal townships and the scrapping of the permit system that allowed Aboriginal people at least some control over access to their land. All this was accompanied by a get tough, quick fix rhetoric that clearly implied where the problem lay. It was with us. It was Aboriginal people who were to blame. Never mind the years of reports to government identifying the problems and suggesting solutions. Never mind the consistent neglect and under-resourcing of services to Aboriginal communities. Never mind the inaction and complacency. No, in the end, it was clear that we were to blame and that John Howard and Mel Brough were now going to give us a good shake, sit us down and get it all sorted out, get us all sorted out once and for all, since we were obviously incapable of doing it ourselves. The paternalism inherent in the intervention seemed to escape most media commentators, but it did not escape Aboriginal people. The difficulty was the intervention presented a real dilemma for Aboriginal people at the local community level as well as the national level. For some, this was a long overdue recognition of the continuing disadvantage of Aboriginal communities and the need to act decisively to end it. On the other hand, there were those who opposed the intervention for its attack on rights that had been hard won by the Indigenous peoples of Australia over many years. And there were many on the continuum between these two positions. People who were trying to get more information about what was being proposed and how it would work, or those who opposed some of the elements of the intervention, were unsure of some, but saw potential in others. However, driven by the media's appetite for conflict and drama, and by the government's own black and white rhetoric, the debate quickly became polarised. We were divided, whether we liked it or not, into those who supported the intervention versus those against, between those who adopted a rights-based approach or those who have focused on the need to protect women and children, as if these were opposing principles. In my view, it is a real problem when public debate about such an important issue becomes polarised in this way. Yet this was inevitable, given the way the intervention was presented to the Australian people. The question remains, what did the former government want to achieve? I don't think we'll ever fully understand well, I won't anyhow, by the process by which federal governments decided on the intervention. The key decisions were taken behind closed doors, and little effort went into uncovering exactly how they were made and who made them. Accordingly, there were lots of speculation about why the intervention was announced. For some, the intervention was a cynical political exercise to wedge the Labor Party and gain narrow political advantage in an election year. As is well documented, the former Prime Minister was practised at finding exactly those issues, such as immigration, which resonated with a large proportion of the Australian public while dividing his political opponents. According to this view, the intervention was Tampa Mark II, and although we are unlikely to ever know for sure, I would certainly not discount this as part of the motivation. Second, some have seen the intervention as an ideologically driven attack on Aboriginal rights. Under this scenario, the NT government's inaction gave Howard the opportunity to advance his agenda in Indigenous affairs, central to which was the undermining of Aboriginal rights to land. There's a view that runs something like this. Clearly, the blacks were getting uppity. They were getting too much control, far too much land, and it was time to put them back in their place. The intervention as a counter-revolution to Wick and Mabo. But this undermining of Aboriginal rights to land, I think, was central to the intervention and explains why so many of its elements had nothing to do with children and why almost none of the recommendations of Little Children Are Sacred were included. However, some saw the intervention as a genuine attempt to address the suffering and neglect of Aboriginal children. Many of our people would have difficulty with this, and indeed, looking at our former Prime Minister, I find it hard to see him as having much compassion for Aboriginal people. Nevertheless, perhaps for others in government at the time, this was part of their motivation. But whether this was true or not, I would argue very strongly that concern by itself is not enough. I remember once seeing a small poster in an Aboriginal medical service which someone had made and put up on the wall, which simply said, "Concern plus ignorance equals paternalism." This sums up neatly to me some of the atmosphere of the intervention which so many of us found so frustrating and demeaning. The assumption that somehow all these years no one had been doing anything for the health and welfare of Aboriginal people until suddenly Mel Bruff rode over the hill on his white charger. You know, there are lots of people, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, who devoted their lives, and some of them are in this room, in fact, to working with Aboriginal and trying to improve Aboriginal health outcomes. So they were left on the sidelines there. I don't know whether you realise that when those clinics went into the Northern Territory, the government clinic or the local Aboriginal Community Control Clinic was still there, but the new clinic was just come and set up somewhere else. So we had 2 clinics in the smallest, and of course we had the army as well. You know, very, very confusing for people. Because the soldiers didn't know what to do. They ended up kicking football with the kids, you know, but still with armed, still with guns. This ignorance of the history and realities of Aboriginal life and the disregard of the evidence of what works in such situations of disadvantage seemed to me to be a key feature of the intervention and those who led it. But whatever the real motivations behind the intervention, one thing I know for sure, it was not the welfare of Aboriginal children and communities alone that drove it. All sorts of these other agendas were at play: political positioning, ideology, electoral advantage, and good old-fashioned arse covering. And this seems to me to be a continuing theme in the history of the relationship between black and white in Australia, that action on Aboriginal disadvantage gets continually caught up in other contradictory agendas. This perhaps has been the biggest barrier to genuine progress. Because you would think that if government was really serious about addressing the disadvantage so many Aboriginal communities suffer, there would have been a rational process, some process, you know, to sit down and look at what the problems were, to look at what has already been tried and what we know works, to look at the kind of principles that we know should underpin action, and then a commitment to action and of resources. We know a lot. We know a lot about Aboriginal people. We know a lot about Aboriginal health. We know a lot about education, employment. I mean, what we don't know, you could put on the end of a pen, pretty much. So we know a lot. We can't pretend that we don't, and the government has access to this whole body of knowledge. Yet they continue to act outside of it, as if we're dumb, or as if Australia is sort of anti-intellect or something. I'm getting really impatient with this point of view. Yet as far as we know, the whole intervention was almost literally designed on the back of an envelope over 2 or 3 days in some offices in Canberra by people who took little account of the evidence and had no understanding of the historical realities of Aboriginal life. Now, some people have said to me, but something had to be done. Of course, I agree. Something had to be done. But if you were seriously ill in hospital and something has to be done, you expect that the something that the hospital staff do to be both aimed at treating the illness and to be based on good evidence. You know, you trust the doctor that he's doing something, he knows what he's doing, that he has a whole body of knowledge and a whole career there. Doing something that is neither well-intentioned nor well-evidenced is unlikely to be helpful, and the intervention was neither well-intentioned nor well-evidenced. I've argued strongly that urgent action was needed, but that it needed to be based on both on the evidence of what we know and works and on our rights. You know, because what we're talking about here is actually, you know, is the protection of children. I don't have time tonight to go into detail about these, but I do want to say that I think that the artificial distinction that the previous government set up between rights-based and practical approaches is false. An approach to addressing Aboriginal disadvantage that is based on respect for our established rights is necessary, because in the long term, it is the only one that, practically speaking, will work. You cannot address endemic social problems without the collaboration of the people affected. I mean, you certainly cannot pretend that the nation-state can intervene in a sensitive and difficult area, such as the relationship between families and children, without the community fundamentally accepting this approach and endorsing it. My experience tells me that our people are more than ready to support an intervention to create better, safer futures for their children. They told us so. But if this is at the expense of their rights, rights that historically have been hard-won, people, even those with the most goodwill, won't cooperate. I know there are some communities where Aboriginal people, and especially Aboriginal women, support some of the aspects of the intervention that others see as violating their rights. There are a number of places, for example, where Aboriginal women have spoken out in support of the compulsory quarantining of Centrelink payments, which, although it necessitated the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act, they say has led to improvements in their communities. Now, if those communities want to collectively make the decision to restrict welfare payments in their community or for particular families, we need to respect those wishes and learn from their experience. Such a model is being trialled in Cape York. The Family Responsibility Commission there is enforcing standards of behaviour and helping people resume responsibility for the well-being of their community and of the individuals and families who live there, especially children. This is a community-based commission from community people who are discussing about their families and then indeed their neighbours, and they come to a negotiated settlement of how they're going to proceed. They do this in a way that aims to encourage and support local authority and justice, not undermine it with blanket, externally imposed solutions. And I ask myself too, what is being put in place to assist those communities and families to resume full control of their welfare payments? Or is the welfare quarantining payments permanent now? This is how it's going to be. Is this how all Aboriginal families are now going to have to live? Because with the intervention in the Northern Territory, there are many places where the welfare quarantine measures in particular have caused much resentment and led people disconnecting from services and processes to address disadvantage. They've stirred up memories not that deeply buried, of times when the nation-state believed it had a role in the personal lives of all Aboriginal people and exercised control over them in a way that it never attempted to do so for non-Aboriginal citizens. This is part of my family history, a history shared by many, many Aboriginal families, when it was taken for granted that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal families should be treated differently, and that the state, with its institutions, had a right to be present, as it were, around the kitchen table. Acknowledging this history and working with the complexities and diversity of Aboriginal life across the Territory and across Australia, accepting that what will work in one place may not necessarily work elsewhere, or at least not without adapting it to the local community, its priorities and capacities. This is one of the key policy challenges that the Australian Government must take up. I've been speaking so far the intervention as it was announced and implemented in those first few months after its announcement in mid-2007. But much has changed since then. In November of that year, a new federal government was elected. We have a commitment to closing the gap. An apology was delivered. The intervention was reviewed, but has largely remained in place. Because, and there have been some changes. But this change has been driven by an enormous amount of work at the local level in the Northern Territory to transform the intervention into something positive. Aboriginal communities, medical services and those in government with goodwill and energy have been working, sometimes literally day and night, for 2 years now, not to waste the opportunity of national attention, to hold governments to their rhetoric. They have persuaded government that compulsory health checks were an unworkable violation of rights, and they were dropped. And there were many people, lots of doctors around the country came in, including the AMA, so the government quickly backed off that at the time. They have used the evidence, those organisations and groups in the Northern Territory, they have used the evidence to show that the kind of fly-in, fly-out medical teams that the intervention gave such prominence to might be good TV, but they are not good health policy. Now, long-term sustainable funding for health services is being rolled out. At the moment it is, anyhow. Some of the more problematic attacks on Aboriginal rights to land have also been rolled back. All this is due to the commitment and knowledge and work of those at the grassroots level. I want to leave you with some words from Barack Obama, whose election at the end of last year had given hope to so many. In his book, Dreams from My Father, he says, "I know, have seen the desperation and disorder of powerless, how it twists the lives of children on the streets of Jakarta or Nairobi or Chicago's South Side, how narrow the path is for them between humiliation and untrammeled fury, how easily they slip into violence and despair. I know that the response of the powerful to this disorder, alternating as it does between a dull complacency and when the disorder spills out of its prescribed confines, a steady, unthinking application of force, and it's inadequate to this task." This describes so well the very process we have experienced in Australia when it comes to the welfare of Aboriginal children. But there is another process at work too. This is the power of the community to argue, to persuade, to use the evidence of their own experience and to transform the world. Their world at least. It is my firm belief that those who so generously spoke to us during the consultations for the Little Children Are Sacred did not deserve a response that was so heavy-handed and so lacking in basic human respect. This still weighs upon me, as I know it does upon Rex, the co-author of the report. We feel that what people told us, what they trusted us with, and what we reported, which was then used by those in power to pursue entirely different aims, in fact to punish. Over the last 2 years, the intervention has been very divisive for the Aboriginal community nationally. But the process has opened up an opportunity for change. The Aboriginal community and their organisations and those who support them are using this opportunity to achieve something permanent and positive. They are continuing for their long struggle to improve the lives of Aboriginal families despite the continuing odds. And in the end, despite everything, I'm hopeful that they will succeed and that Aboriginal children will live safer, happier and more fulfilled lives. But for all this talk, for all the debate, for all the argy-bargy, for all the dialogue, the whole thing, the whole issue, the whole everything is really about keeping Aboriginal children safe so they may grow up and reach their full potential. Thank you.